The silent tears streaming down her face caught the golden glow of sunset as dust swirled around the auction platform. April Emerson stood with her head bowed, her once beautiful calico dress now soiled from days of travel in the prison wagon. Fate had a way of taking everything, and now in Lovelock, Nevada, 1878, she was about to lose the last thing she had left her freedom. "Next up, gentlemen." The auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty town square. "A fine young woman, healthy and strong, good for household work or whatever else you might fancy." His wink sent a wave of laughter through the crowd of miners, ranch hands, and drifters. "Starting bid at $50. April kept her eyes fixed on the rough wooden planks beneath her feet. This wasn't supposed to be her life. 22 years old, and being sold to the highest bidder like livestock, all because her late father's debts had fallen to her after his passing 3 months ago. The bank had seized their small homestead outside Carson City, and the courts had ruled she could work off the remaining debt through indentured service. The bidding started slow but picked up as the men assessed her slender figure and pretty face despite the dirt and exhaustion etched upon it. 65, 70, 75 from Mr. Wilkins, the local saloon owner's voice made April shudder. She'd heard stories of how he treated his purchased girls. $85, called a gruff voice from the back. 100. Wilkins countered, clearly irritated by the competition. April's tears fell faster now, though she made no sound. Her mother had taught her dignity even in the worst circumstances before consumption had taken her 4 years ago. But dignity felt like a distant memory now. 150. The voice from the back grew closer. The crowd parted as a tall figure moved toward the front. April dared a glance upward. A cowboy stood there, his face partially shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, but she could see a strong jawline covered with several days' worth of stubble. His duster coat was dusty from the trail, and he stood with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to facing danger. 175, Wilkins shouted, his face reddening. 200, the cowboy responded calmly. The auctioneer's eyes widened. $200 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 225? Wilkins cursed, spat in the dirt, and shook his head. Going once, going twice. April's heart hammered in her chest, from one owner to another. Would this stern-faced cowboy be any kinder than the saloon keeper? Before the auctioneer could finish, the cowboy stepped forward. "This ends now." His voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "She deserves better than this." The auctioneer's face twisted in confusion. "Sir, you've made the winning bid. She's yours for $200. The cowboy reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch, counting out the gold coins onto the auctioneer's table. Then he turned to address the crowd. "This woman isn't property. No person should be." He looked directly at April, his eyes a startling shade of blue against his sun-darkened skin. "Miss, my name is Jackson Tanner. I just paid your debt, but you don't belong to me or anyone else. You're free to go wherever you please." A hush fell over the crowd. April stared at him, unable to comprehend what was happening. The auctioneer sputtered in protest, but Jackson silenced him with a hard look. "The law says her debt is settled when paid. I've paid it. That ends our business here." He turned back to April and extended his hand toward her. "You can walk away right now if you want. Or if you need a safe place, I have a ranch about 10 miles outside of town. You'd have your own quarters, and I'm looking for help with cooking and keeping house. Paid work, fair wages. Your choice entirely." April looked at his outstretched hand, then back at his face. In his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: respect. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. A shadow passed over Jackson's features. Because I've seen what happens to women sold like this, and because no one stepped in when my sister found herself in a similar position 5 years ago." His voice dropped lower. "I was working cattle drives in Texas then, by the time I got back." He didn't finish the sentence. April hesitated only a moment longer before placing her trembling hand in his. "Thank you, Mr. Tanner. Jackson," he corrected gently. "Let's get you away from here." The crowd parted as Jackson led her down from the platform. Some men looked disappointed, others curious, and a few nodded in what appeared to be respect toward Jackson. Wilkins glared daggers at them both as they passed. "You've made an enemy today, Tanner," the saloon keeper hissed. Jackson didn't even turn his head. "Wouldn't be the first time, won't be the last." He guided April to where a handsome chestnut gelding waited patiently. A second horse, a dappled gray mare, stood beside it. "I figured you might need a ride, whatever you decided," Jackson explained, seeing her questioning look. "Can you ride?" April nodded. "My father taught me when I was young." "Good." He helped her mount, his touch respectful and brief. "Town's not safe for you tonight. Wilkins doesn't take losing well. We'll head to the ranch, get you fed and rested. Tomorrow, if you want to move on, I'll give you enough money to make a proper start somewhere else." As they rode away from Lovelock, April studied her unexpected savior's profile. Jackson Tanner didn't look like any hero from the dime novels. He looked weathered, practical, maybe even dangerous to those who crossed him. But something in the way he'd stood up to that crowd, the quiet dignity with which he declared her humanity, it stirred something inside her that had been dormant for a very long time. Hope. The sun had fully set by the time they crested the final hill before Jackson's ranch. April's body ached from the ride after days of sitting cramped in a prison wagon, but the sight below made her forget her discomfort. Nestled in a small valley with a creek running through it sat a modest but well-maintained ranch house with a barn and several corrals. A few cattle grazed in the distance and smoke curled from the chimney. "It's not much," Jackson said, misinterpreting her silence, "but it's peaceful." "It's beautiful," April whispered honestly. As they approached, the front door of the house opened, and an older woman stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're back earlier than expected, Jackson," she called. Then she noticed April and her eyebrows rose in surprise. "Mrs. Hodson, this is Miss April Emerson," Jackson introduced as they dismounted. "She'll be staying with us for a while. Miss Emerson, this is Mrs. Hodson, the finest housekeeper in all of Nevada Territory." The older woman's shrewd eyes took in April's disheveled appearance and the tear tracks on her face. To her credit, she asked no questions but simply nodded. "Well then, you must be hungry, child. Come inside while Jackson sees to the horses." April found herself ushered into a warm kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and beef stew. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her she hadn't eaten since a meager breakfast of hardtack and water. "When did you last eat properly?" Mrs. Hodson asked, already ladling stew into a bowl. "I'm not sure," April admitted. "Eat then. Afterward, I'll draw you a bath and find you something clean to wear." April ate gratefully, trying not to wolf down the food despite her hunger. The stew was the most delicious thing she'd tasted in months. As she finished, Jackson came in from the barn, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Better?" he asked, seeing some color had returned to her cheeks. April nodded. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Hodson. I've explained to Miss Emerson that she's welcome to stay on as paid help if she wishes, or move on tomorrow with some money to start fresh elsewhere." The housekeeper nodded. "A sensible arrangement. Now, if you'll excuse us, this young lady needs a proper bath and rest." Jackson nodded. "I'll be in the barn finishing up some work if you need me." After he left, Mrs. Hodson led April to a small bathroom off the kitchen where a copper tub sat. As the older woman pumped water and set it to heating on the stove, April finally found her voice. Was there really an auction in town today? Mrs. Hodson asked, her voice careful. April nodded, swallowing hard. For my father's debts. After he died, they took everything. Said I still owed more. Mrs. Hodson's lips pressed into a thin line. Shameful, simply shameful. That Jackson went into town today was Providence itself. She patted April's shoulder. He's a good man, though he carries his own burdens. Lost his sister to a terrible situation, then his parents to influenza 2 years ago. This ranch is all he has left of them. Once the bath was ready, Mrs. Hodson left April to soak in blessed privacy. The warm water soothed her aching muscles, and the soft lavender soap felt like unimaginable luxury after weeks of grime. As she washed away the dirt, April found herself wondering about Jackson Tanner. What kind of man spent $200 to free a stranger? Clean and dressed in a borrowed nightgown and robe, April was shown to a small but comfortable bedroom. The sheets were crisp and smelled of sunshine, and the bed felt softer than anything she remembered. Sleep as long as you need, Mrs. Hodson told her. No one will disturb you. Sleep came almost instantly, deep and dreamless for the first time in months. April woke to sunlight streaming through curtains she didn't recognize. For a moment, panic seized her before memories of the previous day flooded back. She was at Jackson Tanner's ranch. She was safe. She was free. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Miss Emerson, there's breakfast when you're ready, Mrs. Hodson called. Thank you, I'll be right out. April found a simple but clean dress laid out for her clearly from Mrs. Hodson's younger days, though the woman must be past 50 now. It fit well enough, and April felt almost human again as she made her way to the kitchen. Jackson sat at the table, a cup of coffee in hand, reading what appeared to be a letter. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment he seemed struck silent. "Good morning," April offered, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "Good morning," he replied, standing quickly. "You look rested." Mrs. Hodson bustled in from the pantry. Sit. Eggs and bacon coming right up, and there's fresh bread." As April ate, Jackson explained more about the ranch. It was smaller than many in the area, just over 100 head of cattle, some chickens, a vegetable garden, and a small apple orchard that his mother had insisted on planting. "It's enough for a decent living," he said. "I've got 2 hands who help with the cattle, brothers named Cal and Henry. They live in the bunkhouse out back. Good men, though Henry talks enough for 10 people." "And what would my duties be if I decided to stay?" April asked. "Cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever Mrs. Hodson needs help with. She's been trying to do it all herself since my mother passed, but it's too much for one person." He paused. "The pay is $15 a month plus room and board. It's not a fortune, but it's honest work. $15 a month, more than April had seen in the past year. With her father's failing health, their small farm had produced barely enough to survive. "I'd like to stay," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "At least for a while, if that's all right." Jackson nodded, something like relief flashing across his face. "Good, that's good." After breakfast, Mrs. Hodson showed April around the house, a modest but well-built structure with the kitchen and sitting room downstairs, along with Jackson's study and a small washroom. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, Jackson's, Mrs. Hodson's, April's, and one kept ready for guests, though Mrs. Hodson admitted they rarely came. This was his parents' home, Mrs. Hodson explained as they folded laundry together. Built it themselves 20 years ago when they first came out from Missouri. "I've been with the family since Jackson was just 12. His mother was my dearest friend." And his sister, the one he mentioned? April asked hesitantly. Mrs. Hodson's face grew somber. Julia, sweet girl, just a year older than Jackson. She went to San Francisco to work as a companion to a wealthy woman. The position fell through, and she found herself alone in the city with little money. A man offered her work and, well, she disappeared into one of those houses. By the time Jackson tracked her down 2 years later, the consumption had her. She died in his arms. April's hand flew to her mouth. How awful! It changed him. He'd always been quiet, but after that, he throws himself into the ranch work, hardly ever goes to town except for supplies. Mrs. Hodson folded the last sheet with practiced movements. That's why I was so surprised to see him bring you home yesterday. It's not like him to involve himself in other people's troubles anymore. April pondered this as they moved on to preparing the midday meal. Jackson had paid a small fortune to free her from a fate similar to his sister's. She couldn't help but wonder if he saw Julia when he looked at her, another young woman on the brink of disaster. The thought should have bothered her, being a reminder of someone lost, but somehow it didn't. There was something deeply honorable in his actions, regardless of his motivations. Around noon, Jackson and his 2 ranch hands came in for dinner. Cal and Henry Palmer were indeed brothers, though they looked nothing alike. Cal was tall and lean with a serious demeanor, while Henry was shorter, stockier, and immediately launched into an animated story about a stubborn heifer that had them tracking her for hours. Miss Emerson, Jackson introduced her. These are the Palmer brothers. They work the herd and keep the fences mended when they're not chasing wayward cattle through the brush. Pleasure to meet you, madam, Cal said with a respectful nod. Henry beamed. Mrs. Hodson mentioned we had a new face around here. Mighty nice to have another person to talk to besides these 2 grumps and the cows. April couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. It's nice to meet you both. As they ate, April observed Jackson with his men. He was clearly the boss, but there was an easy respect between them. He listened to their concerns about the north pasture needing better irrigation and made decisions without being overbearing. It was clear they genuinely liked working for him. After the men had gone back out, April helped Mrs. Hodson with the dishes. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jackson in one of the corrals, working with a young horse. His movements were patient, gentle but firm, showing the animal what he wanted rather than forcing it. He's good with the horses, Mrs. Hodson commented, following April's gaze. Has a way of earning their trust. His father was the same. The days fell into an easy rhythm after that. April rose early, helped prepare breakfast, then spent the morning assisting Mrs. Hodson with whatever needed doing: washing, cleaning, baking, tending the vegetable garden. The work was hard but satisfying, so different from the desperate struggle of her last months on her father's failing farm. Jackson was often out working with the cattle or making repairs around the property, but he always came in for meals, unfailingly polite but somewhat reserved. Sometimes April would catch him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, his expression unreadable. A week into her stay, April was hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Jackson returning early from checking the herd, a package tied to his saddle. "Afternoon, Miss Emerson," he said, dismounting. "Mr. Tanner," she replied with a nod, though they both knew she'd taken to calling him Jackson during meals. He seemed uncharacteristically hesitant as he untied the package. "I was in town picking up supplies. Thought you might." "Well, that dress of Mrs. Hodson's is fine, but I figured you might want something of your own." He handed her the brown paper package. Inside, April found fabric enough for 2 dresses, one a pretty blue cotton, the other a warm brown wool along with thread, buttons, and even a bit of lace trim. "I didn't know what you might prefer," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mrs. Cooper at the general store helped me choose. Said a woman should have at least 2 dresses to her name." April ran her fingers over the fabric, touched beyond words by the thoughtful gesture. "This is very generous, Jackson." "It's nothing," he insisted, though his ears had gone slightly red. "Just practical. Winter will be here before we know it, and you'll need something warmer than that cotton dress." But they both knew it was more than practicality. It was his way of saying she belonged here, that this wasn't just a temporary arrangement but somewhere she could put down roots if she chose. "Thank you," she said simply, meeting his eyes. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection, an understanding. Then Jackson cleared his throat and nodded toward the house. "Better get that horse unsaddled. Mrs. Hodson will have my hide if I'm late for supper again." April watched him lead his horse toward the barn, a small smile playing at her lips. For the first time since her father's death, she felt a sense of possibility opening before her. That evening, after supper, April sat by the fireplace with Mrs. Hodson, measuring and cutting the blue fabric. Jackson sat at the table nearby, going over accounts in his ledger. The domesticity of the scene wasn't lost on April. It felt like a family, something she'd been without for too long. "Did you always want to be a rancher?" she asked Jackson, breaking the comfortable silence. He looked up, surprised by the question. "I suppose I did. Grew up watching my father work this land. Never really considered anything else." "He always had a way with animals," Mrs. Hodson added. "Even as a boy, his mother used to joke that he could talk to them." Jackson shot the housekeeper a mock stern look. "Don't go telling tales, Mrs. Hodson." "It's hardly a tale when it's true," the older woman retorted, then turned to April. "Found a wounded wolf pup once, no bigger than a minute. Against all good sense, he nursed that thing back to health in the barn. His father was fit to be tied. What happened to it?" April asked, charmed by the image of a young Jackson tending to a wild creature. "Returned him to the wild once he was strong enough," Jackson answered. "He hung around the edges of the property for years after that, never caused any trouble with the livestock." "Because he knew better than to cross Jackson Tanner," Mrs. Hodson said with a wink at April. Jackson shook his head, but April could see the fondness in his eyes for the older woman. It was clear Mrs. Hodson was more family than employee. "And you, Miss Emerson?" Jackson asked, shifting the conversation. "What did you dream of becoming before?" Circumstances intervened. April's hand stilled on the fabric. "I wanted to be a teacher once. I even had a place at a small school in Carson City, but then my mother fell ill and I needed to help at home." She resumed her cutting. "After she passed, my father needed me even more. Dreams have a way of changing when duty calls." Jackson nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That they do. But dreams can find new paths," Mrs. Hodson observed, giving April's hand a pat. "Nothing says you can't still teach someday." April smiled at the kind words but didn't respond. Her old dreams seemed to belong to another person now, a girl who hadn't yet learned how quickly life could change, how precarious security could be. Yet as she glanced at Jackson, now returned to his ledger, a new feeling stirred inside her. Not quite a dream yet, but perhaps the beginning of one. The next week brought unexpected drama to the quiet ranch. April was in the garden harvesting late tomatoes when she heard raised voices from the direction of the barn. Curious, she made her way toward the sound and found Jackson in a tense conversation with a man she didn't recognize. The stranger wore a deputy's badge and didn't look happy. "I'm just passing along what I heard, Jackson," the deputy was saying. "Wilkins has been running his mouth all over town about how you stole what was rightfully his. Says he had a prior arrangement with Donovan about that auction." "Donovan the auctioneer is as crooked as they come," "And you know it, Mark," Jackson replied, his voice controlled but hard. What Wilkins wanted was another girl for his backroom business. You really want to stand there and defend that? The deputy Mark sighed and removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Course not. But thought you should know he's been asking a lot of questions about the woman you took home. Described her pretty accurately, too. Someone's been watching your place." April inadvertently gasped, drawing both men's attention. "Miss Emerson," Jackson said, motioning her forward. "This is Deputy Mark Collins, an old friend. Mark, this is Miss April Emerson." The deputy nodded politely. "Madam, sorry to bring trouble to your door." "What exactly does Mr. Wilkins want?" April asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear rising within her. "Claims you still owe him money beyond what Jackson paid," Mark explained. "Says he had an agreement with your father before he died." April shook her head firmly. "That's impossible. My father would never have dealt with someone like that. The only debts were to the bank in Carson City. I saw the papers myself." "Doesn't surprise me Wilkins would invent a claim," Jackson said grimly. "He's not one to let go of a grudge or potential profit." Deputy Collins replaced his hat. "Just be careful, both of you. Wilkins has friends in some unsavory places. I'll keep an ear out in town, let you know if I hear anything more concrete." After he'd ridden off, Jackson turned to April, concern etched on his face. "I'm sorry to have brought this trouble on you." "You didn't bring it," April insisted. "You saved me from it. If not for you, I'd be—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Jackson's jaw tightened. "I won't let him near you. This is my land and you're under my protection now." There was a fierce protectiveness in his voice that made April's heart beat faster. She knew she should be frightened by the threat Wilkins posed, but standing there with Jackson, she felt oddly secure despite the danger. That evening at supper, Jackson informed Mrs. Hodson and the Palmer brothers about the deputy's warning. All agreed to keep a sharper eye out for strangers near the property. "Henry and I can take turns keeping watch at night," Cal offered. "At least for a while, till this blows over." "I appreciate that," Jackson said, "but I don't want to disrupt your rest. I'll handle the night watching myself." "Not alone, you won't," Henry protested. "Can't keep a proper watch if you never sleep." In the end, they worked out a rotation between the three men. April felt guilty about causing such disruption, but when she tried to apologize, Jackson silenced her with a gentle but firm look. "This isn't your burden to bear, April. Wilkins and men like him have been bullying this territory for too long. Someone needs to stand up to them." It was the first time he'd used her first name without the miss, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a strange warmth through her. That night, April found sleep elusive. Knowing Jackson was outside somewhere in the darkness, standing guard because of her, filled her with conflicting emotions. Gratitude, certainly, but also something deeper, more complicated. After tossing and turning for hours, she rose, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and went downstairs to make some tea. To her surprise, Jackson sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him, his rifle propped against the wall nearby. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked as she entered. April shook her head. "Thought some tea might help. Fire's still hot. Kettle shouldn't take long to boil." They sat in companionable silence as April prepared her tea. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods along the creek, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. "I keep thinking about what Deputy Collins said," April finally ventured. "About Wilkins claiming my father owed him money. It bothers me that someone would use my father's name for such a lie." Jackson studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "Tell me about him. Your father." April wrapped her hands around her warm cup. "He was a good man. Worked hard all his life. He came west from Pennsylvania after the war, hoping to make a fresh start. Met my mother in Carson City and they started the farm together. She smiled at the memory. He loved books. Used to read to me every night, even after I could read for myself. Said the sound of the words mattered as much as their meaning. Sounds like a man of principle, Jackson observed. He was. After my mother died, something in him seemed to fade. He kept working the farm, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. The last year was especially hard. Drought killed half our crops, and he'd been sick on and off. April blinked back unexpected tears. I tried to keep things going, but it was too much. Jackson's hand covered hers briefly. You did everything you could. Some things are beyond our control. The simple touch, the understanding in his voice, it broke something open inside her. The tears she'd held back for months finally spilled over, and once they started, she couldn't stop them. Jackson said nothing, just moved his chair closer and let her cry, his solid presence a comfort in itself. When the storm of emotion finally passed, April wiped her eyes, embarrassed. I'm sorry. I don't usually. Don't apologize for grief, Jackson said quietly. It's the price we pay for loving someone. April looked up at him, seeing his own loss reflected in his eyes. You still miss your sister, he nodded. Every day. And my parents. The pain changes over time, becomes something you can carry, but it never truly leaves. No, it doesn't, April agreed. Then, gathering her courage, she added, Thank you, Jackson, not just for tonight, but for everything. I don't know what would have become of me if you hadn't been there that day. His eyes held hers, deep and serious. I'm glad I was. Something shifted between them in that moment, a barrier lowering, a connection deepening. April felt it as surely as she felt the warmth of her teacup between her palms. In Jackson's steadfast presence, she'd found not just safety but understanding. Someone who saw her grief and didn't try to diminish it or hurry her through it. The next morning, April woke feeling lighter despite the continuing threat from Wilkins. She threw herself into her work with renewed energy, helping Mrs. Hodson preserve the last of the garden vegetables for winter and beginning work on her new dresses in the evenings. Jackson continued to divide his time between ranch work and keeping watch, though he insisted April carry on with her normal activities. No sense in letting Wilkins disrupt our lives any more than necessary, he said. A week passed without incident, then another. Gradually, the heightened vigilance began to relax. Cal and Henry returned to their normal schedules, though Jackson still took turns riding the property perimeter each evening before turning in. As October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color to the cottonwoods, April found herself settling into life at the Tanner Ranch as if she'd always been there. The work was satisfying, the company pleasant, and for the first time in years, she felt truly at home. She had finished her blue dress and wore it proudly to Sunday dinner, a meal that had become something of a special occasion each week, with Mrs. Hodson preparing a roast, and sometimes a pie if fruit was available. When April entered the dining room that Sunday, Jackson stopped mid-conversation with Cal, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her in the new dress. That turned out mighty fine, Miss April, Henry said appreciatively. Blue's definitely your color. Thank you, she replied, smoothing the skirt self-consciously. The fabric was so lovely to work with. It suits you, Jackson said simply, but the warmth in his eyes said more than his words. After dinner, while the others relaxed in the sitting room, April and Jackson found themselves alone on the front porch. The evening was crisp, but not yet cold, the sky a riot of stars above the darkened valley. Winter will be here soon, Jackson observed, his breath just beginning to fog in the evening air. Mrs. Hodson says it can get quite harsh up here, April replied. It can. Heavy snow sometimes, though we're not as bad as up in the Sierras, He glanced at her. "First winter in Nevada." April nodded. "We arrived in spring 3 years ago. Father always said we came west just in time to miss the worst of winter." "Smart man," Jackson smiled. "But winter has its own beauty here. The mountains with fresh snow in the morning light, there's nothing quite like it." "I look forward to seeing it," April said, then realized what her words implied, that she planned to stay through winter and beyond. Jackson seemed to catch the implication too. He turned to face her more fully. "April, I want you to know that you're welcome here for as long as you wish to stay. This position, it's not temporary unless you want it to be." April's heart quickened. "And if I wanted to stay indefinitely?" Something flickered in Jackson's eyes, hope perhaps, or something deeper. "Then this would be your home, plain and simple." The word home resonated through her. Home had been a tenuous concept since her mother's death, becoming even more fragile after her father passed. The idea of putting down roots again, of belonging somewhere, it was almost too much to hope for. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. Jackson's smile was brief but genuine, transforming his usually serious face. He looked as though he might say more, but the moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hooves, multiple riders coming fast. Jackson was immediately alert, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his hip. "Get inside," he told April, his voice tight. "Now." She hurried into the house as Jackson called for Cal and Henry. By the time the three men had armed themselves and stepped onto the porch, 4 riders had pulled up in the yard, their faces shadowed in the gathering dusk. "Evening, gentlemen," Jackson called, his voice deceptively casual despite the rifle in his hands. "You're a long way from town." April watched through the window, her heart pounding. Mrs. Hodson stood beside her, a shotgun in her own gnarled hands. "Tanner," one of the riders called back. "Mr. Wilkins sends his regards, says you've had enough time to enjoy his property. He wants the woman returned tonight." "There's no one here belonging to Wilkins," Jackson replied evenly. "I suggest you boys turn around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of." The lead rider laughed, an ugly sound. "Figured you'd say something like that." "Wilkins said if you wouldn't be reasonable, we should help ourselves to some compensation instead." He gestured to the corral where several horses watched the proceedings nervously. "Those 2 Appaloosas would fetch a nice price." "You're not taking anything from this property except maybe some lead if you don't clear out," Cal growled, raising his rifle slightly. The tension stretched taut as a wire. April held her breath, terrified of what might happen next. These men hadn't come for horses, that was just an excuse. They'd come for her, or to hurt Jackson for interfering with Wilkins' plans. Suddenly, the sound of more hoofbeats broke the standoff. 3 more riders appeared, and April's heart sank until she recognized Deputy Collins at the lead. "Evening, boys," the deputy called, riding up alongside the first group. "Bit late for a social call, isn't it?" The lead rider cursed under his breath. "Just passing through, deputy, having a friendly chat with Tanner here." "Is that right?" Collins' voice dripped with skepticism. "Because from town, it looked an awful lot like you were following orders from Wilkins to cause trouble out here." He spat into the dirt. "Now, I may not have enough evidence yet to lock Wilkins up for his sideline businesses, but trespassing and attempted theft, that I can do something about right now." A tense silence followed, then the lead rider shrugged. "No harm done, we'll be on our way." "You do that," Collins agreed. "And you tell Wilkins that the Tanner property is under the law's watch now. Any more trouble out this way will land him in front of Judge Whittaker faster than he can blink." The men turned their horses and rode off into the darkness. Only when they were well out of sight did April release the breath she'd been holding. Deputy Collins dismounted and approached the porch. Thought they might try something like this. Wilkins has been drinking and making threats all day. Appreciate the warning, Mark, Jackson said, lowering his rifle. And the timely arrival, Collins nodded. One of my deputies and I will take turns riding out this way for the next few weeks. Might cool Wilkins' enthusiasm if he knows the law is paying attention. After ensuring all was secure, the deputy and his men departed, promising to return at irregular intervals to check on things. Jackson sent Cal and Henry to make a thorough check of the property while he came inside to reassure April and Mrs. Hodson. "Are you all right?" he asked April, his eyes searching her face. She nodded, though her hands still trembled slightly. "They really came for me, didn't they?" Jackson's expression hardened. "Wilkins sent them, yes, but not just for you to send a message to me as well. Men like him can't stand being crossed." "This is my fault," April whispered. "I've brought danger to your home, to everyone here." "No." Jackson's voice was firm as he took her hands in his. "This is Wilkins' doing, not yours, and I won't let him or anyone else threaten what matters to me." The way he looked at her when he said those words made April's heart skip a beat. There was a possessiveness there, but not the kind that sought to own or control, rather, the fierce protectiveness of someone defending what they treasured. That night, despite the earlier danger, April slept soundly, comforted by the knowledge that Jackson kept watch nearby. Whatever came next, she knew she wasn't facing it alone. The following weeks brought a gradual easing of tensions. Deputy Collins and his men made good on their promise to patrol regularly, and there were no further incidents from Wilkins or his men. Jackson maintained a vigilant eye on the property, but ranch life settled back into its normal rhythms as November arrived, bringing the first light snowfall to the higher elevations. April finished her second dress, the warm brown wool, just in time for the cooling temperatures. Life took on a cozy intimacy as more activities moved indoors with the changing season. Evenings were spent around the fire, with Mrs. Hodson teaching April to knit, while Jackson read aloud from one of the books his father had collected over the years. On one such evening, as Jackson read from The Last of the Mohicans, April found herself watching him more than listening to the words. The firelight cast his features in a warm glow, softening the weathered lines of his face. When he glanced up and caught her watching, she didn't look away as she might have once done. Instead, she smiled, and he returned it before continuing to read. Later, as Mrs. Hodson retired for the night, April and Jackson found themselves alone by the fire. "You have a good reading voice," April commented. "It reminds me of my father's." "High praise indeed," Jackson replied, "though I suspect your father had more practice at it. He did love to read aloud." April's fingers worked steadily at the scarf. She was knitting her first real project under Mrs. Hodson's tutelage. "I think he would have liked you." Jackson looked pleased at the thought. "And what about you, April? What do you think of the life you found here?" The directness of the question caught her off guard, but she answered honestly. "I think I've found something I never expected to find again after losing my parents a home, people who care what happens to me." She hesitated, then added quietly, "Someone I care about deeply in return." The confession hung in the air between them, its meaning unmistakable. Jackson set the book aside and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "When I saw you that day in Lovelock," he said slowly, "standing there so brave despite your tears, I told myself I was just doing what any decent man would do, that I couldn't stand by and watch another young woman be sold like property." He took a deep breath, but it was more than that. "Something about you. I couldn't explain it then, and maybe I still can't now. I just knew I needed to bring you home." "Home," April repeated softly. "It feels like that now, like I was meant to be here." Jackson's hand found hers, warm and strong. "I believe you were." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotion. Then, with infinite gentleness, Jackson leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, almost tentative, but it sent a current of feeling through April unlike anything she'd experienced before. When they parted, Jackson searched her face. "I've wanted to do that for weeks now," he admitted, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "I hope I haven't overstepped." April shook her head, smiling through sudden tears. "Not at all." This time she initiated the kiss, and Jackson responded with greater confidence, his hand coming up to cradle her cheek. In that moment, April felt the last pieces of her broken heart mend and reshape themselves around this man who had saved her in more ways than one. When they finally separated, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to rush this," he whispered. "You've been through so much. I want to court you properly, the way you deserve." April felt a surge of affection at his old-fashioned sensibility. "I'd like that very much." And so began a proper courtship, albeit one conducted primarily within the confines of the ranch, due to the lingering concern about Wilkins. Jackson brought April wildflowers he found on his rides, carved her a delicate wooden hairpin, and took her on picnics to his favorite spots on the property when weather permitted. Mrs. Hodson watched their blossoming romance with undisguised approval, while Cal maintained a respectful distance and Henry teased them good-naturedly. It was, April reflected, like having a real family again, people who supported each other through good times and bad. As November deepened toward Thanksgiving, the ranch began preparations for winter in earnest. The last of the cattle were brought down from the high pastures, the barn was stocked with extra hay, and preserves were inventoried to ensure they'd last through the cold months. One crisp morning, Jackson announced he needed to make a trip to Lovelock for supplies before the first heavy snow made travel difficult. April immediately volunteered to accompany him, despite not having left the ranch since her arrival. "Are you certain?" Jackson asked, concern in his eyes. "Wilkins might still be holding a grudge." "I can't hide forever," April replied firmly. "Besides, Deputy Collins said Wilkins has been quieter lately, and—" She smiled up at him. "I'd like to see the town properly this time, not from an auction platform." Jackson hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but we stay together and we'll be armed, and we'll bring Cal along as well, just to be safe." The trip to town the next day felt like a grand adventure to April. Bundled in her warm dress and a heavy shawl, Mrs. Hodson insisted she take. April rode beside Jackson in the wagon, with Cal following on horseback. The landscape had changed since her first journey to the ranch, the hills dusted with snow, the cottonwoods along the creeks bare of leaves, the sky a brilliant, cold blue. Lovelock appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in the valley. As they drew closer, April felt a flutter of anxiety, remembering her last experience there. Jackson seemed to sense her unease and reached over to squeeze her hand reassuringly. "Different circumstances now," he reminded her. "You're not alone this time." The town was busier than April expected, with ranchers and miners stocking up before winter set in. As they tied up in front of the general store, several people nodded greetings to Jackson. A few curious glances came April's way, but none seemed hostile. Inside the store, Mrs. Cooper, a plump woman with kind eyes who had helped Jackson select April's fabric, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Tanner. And this must be Miss Emerson. Lovely to meet you properly, dear." She appraised April's brown wool dress. "I see my fabric recommendations were put to good use. The color suits you beautifully." "Thank you," April replied, warming to the friendly shopkeeper. "You chose wonderfully." while Jackson consulted his supply list. Mrs. Cooper engaged April in conversation, introducing her to a few other local women who entered the store. To April's surprise, they were welcoming and curious about life on the Tanner Ranch, with no mention of how she'd arrived there. Jackson Tanner's kept to himself these past few years, one older woman confided. Good to see him with some company besides those Palmer boys and Mrs. Hodson. The shopping took most of the morning, with Jackson methodically working through his list, while April added a few items of her own, some special spices for Mrs. Hodson, yarn for more knitting projects, and a book of poetry she thought Jackson might enjoy. As they were loading their purchases into the wagon, Deputy Collins appeared, tipping his hat in greeting. "Good to see you both in town," he said. "Everything quiet out at the ranch, peaceful as can be," Jackson confirmed. "How are things here?" Collins glanced around before answering. "Wilkins has been keeping his head down since Judge Whittaker fined him for that disturbance at the saloon last month. Took some wind out of his sails, I think." He nodded toward April. "Still, might be best not to linger too long today." They took his advice, deciding to have a quick meal at the hotel dining room before heading back. As they entered the establishment, April was aware of eyes turning their way, but the atmosphere remained civil. Jackson led her to a table near the back, positioning himself so he could see the door. They had just received their food when the dining room door opened, and a hush fell over the space. Jackson tensed beside her, and April turned to see a well-dressed man enter, flanked by two rough-looking companions. Even without introduction, she knew instinctively this was Wilkins. He spotted them immediately, his face hardening into a mask of contempt. For a moment, April feared he would approach, but after a long, tense stare, he deliberately turned away and took a table on the opposite side of the room. "Breathe," Jackson murmured to her. "He won't try anything here, not with so many witnesses." April nodded, forcing herself to continue eating despite her lost appetite. Throughout the meal, she could feel Wilkins watching them, but, true to Jackson's prediction, he made no move to confront them. As they prepared to leave, Jackson placed money on the table and helped April with her shawl. They had almost reached the door when Wilkins' voice cut through the general conversation. "Still hiding behind Tanner's charity, I see." April froze, but Jackson's hand at the small of her back urged her forward. "Keep walking," he whispered, but Wilkins wasn't finished. He raised his voice so everyone in the dining room could hear. "Tell me, Miss Emerson, does he make you earn your keep in other ways besides housekeeping? Man doesn't spend $200 without expecting something in return." The crude implication hit April like a physical blow. Around them, conversation stopped as diners turned to stare. Jackson's body went rigid beside her, and she could feel the fury radiating from him. Before Jackson could respond, April turned to face Wilkins directly. The fear she'd felt moments ago had transformed into something else: indignation, yes, but also a strange sense of power. This man had no hold over her anymore. "Mr. Wilkins," she said, her voice steady and clear in the silent room, "I understand you're bitter about not getting your way at that auction. But what truly bothers you, I think, is that Mr. Tanner showed everyone exactly what kind of man you are, the kind who would profit from another person's misfortune and call it business." Wilkins' face darkened with rage. "You little—" "I wouldn't finish that sentence if I were you," Jackson cut in, his tone dangerous. One of Wilkins' companions started to rise, but the saloon keeper held up a hand to stop him. His eyes narrowed as he looked between April and Jackson. "You two deserve each other," he sneered. "The self-righteous rancher and his charity case. Enjoy it while it lasts, Miss Emerson. Men tire of their toys eventually." April felt Jackson tense to move toward Wilkins, but she gripped his arm. "He's not worth it," she murmured. Then, louder, she addressed the room at large. "Good day, everyone. Lovely to make your acquaintance." With that, she turned and walked out, head held high, Jackson a protective presence at her side. Only when they were outside did she allow herself to tremble slightly. "I'm proud of you," Jackson said quietly as they walked to the wagon. "That took courage." "I was terrified," April admitted. "Courage isn't about not being afraid," Jackson replied. "It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear." Cal, who had been watching the wagon during their meal, took one look at their faces and mounted up without asking questions. The ride home was mostly silent, each lost in their own thoughts. As the ranch came into view, Jackson finally spoke. "I'm sorry you had to face that today." April looked at him, realizing suddenly that he was genuinely distressed on her behalf. "Jackson, I'm not. For months, I've been running from what happened, the auction, the humiliation of it. Today, I finally stood my ground." She smiled slightly. "It felt good, actually." Jackson studied her face, then nodded slowly. "You're remarkable, April Emerson." That evening, after supper, Jackson asked April to join him for a walk despite the chill in the air. They strolled toward the creek, the nearly full moon providing ample light. "I've been thinking about what Wilkins said," Jackson began hesitantly. "Please don't let his crude remarks bother you," April said. "No one with any sense would believe them. It's not that." Jackson stopped walking, turning to face her. "It's about how this all began with me buying your contract. I never want you to feel obligated to me because of that." April's heart constricted at the uncertainty in his voice. "Jackson Tanner, if you think for one moment that my feelings for you have anything to do with obligation, then you haven't been paying attention these past months." He smiled at that, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "I've been paying very close attention, actually." His expression grew serious again. "Which is why I need to ask you something important." April's pulse quickened as Jackson took both her hands in his. "I know this isn't the most conventional courtship," he said. "Meeting the way we did, you coming to live at the ranch before we even really knew each other. But these past months have shown me something I never expected to find again after losing so much of my family, a chance at happiness, at building something lasting." He took a deep breath. "April Emerson, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had begun to hope for this moment, the reality of it still took her breath away. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes filling with happy tears. "Yes, Jackson." His face broke into a rare, full smile as he pulled her into his arms. Their kiss beneath the winter moon sealed a promise that had begun on a dusty auction platform months earlier, a promise of protection that had grown into something far deeper and more enduring. News of their engagement was met with enthusiastic approval from the ranch household. Mrs. Hodson immediately began planning a special Christmas celebration that would double as an engagement party, while Henry suggested they invite half the territory to show off the boss's good fortune. Even the usually stoic Cal offered quiet congratulations, telling April that the ranch had never felt more like a home than since her arrival. With winter settling in earnest over the Nevada landscape, the ranch became a cozy haven of domestic activity. April threw herself into preparations not just for Christmas, but for her future as Mrs. Jackson Tanner. There were linens to inventory, curtains to sew for what would soon be their shared bedroom, and countless conversations with Jackson about their hopes for the future. "I've always wanted children," she admitted one evening as they sat together by the fire. "A house full of them, if possible." Jackson's eyes had softened at that. "My mother used to say this house was built for a large family. 5 bedrooms originally, before we converted one to storage after my parents passed." He took her hand, tracing the lines of her palm with his thumb. "I'd like that very much to fill this house with our children." The weeks leading up to Christmas passed in a blur of happiness for April. The only shadow on her joy was the knowledge that her parents wouldn't be there to see her wed. She mentioned this to Jackson one evening as they prepared decorations for the tree Henry had brought in from the foothills. "I wish they could have known you," she said softly. "Especially my father. He would have appreciated the man you are." Jackson set down the greenery he was arranging and came to sit beside her. "Tell me what he would have wanted for you in a husband," he said. "I'd like to know if I measure up." April smiled at the earnestness in his question. "He would have wanted someone honest and hardworking, someone who respected me as a person, not just as a wife." She touched Jackson's cheek gently. "Someone with the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. So yes, Jackson Tanner, you measure up very well indeed." Christmas Day dawned bright and clear, with fresh snow blanketing the landscape. The house was filled with delicious smells as Mrs. Hodson outdid herself preparing the feast. Deputy Collins and his wife arrived mid-morning, followed by the town doctor and his family, and a few neighboring ranchers Jackson had invited. April wore her blue dress, now adorned with a lace collar she'd added specially for the occasion, and a ribbon Jackson had given her as an early Christmas gift. As she moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and sharing their plans for a spring wedding, she couldn't help but marvel at how dramatically her life had changed in just a few short months. From the depths of despair on that auction platform to this moment of pure joy, it seemed almost unreal. Yet each time she caught Jackson's eye across the room, the love she saw there grounded her in the present, in the life they were building together. After the guests had departed and the house had quieted, Jackson led April to the porch where they stood wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars emerge in the clear winter sky. "Happy?" he asked, his breath forming a cloud in the cold air. April leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body. "More than I ever thought possible." "You know," Jackson said thoughtfully, "when I rode into Lovelock that day, I had no intention of attending any auction. I was just there to pick up fencing supplies." April looked up at him in surprise. "Really? Then how did you end up there? I heard a man in the general store talking about it, how there was going to be a pretty little thing on the block that afternoon. Something about the way he said it." Jackson shook his head. "I couldn't just ride away." "Providence," April murmured, echoing Mrs. Hodson's words from months ago. "Maybe so," Jackson agreed. "All I know is that when I saw you standing there with those silent tears on your face, I knew I couldn't let them treat you like that. And when I said you deserved better—" He tilted her face up to his. "I had no idea then that better might include me." "It definitely includes you," April assured him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. As winter gave way to spring, preparations for the wedding intensified. April's brown wool dress was set aside in favor of creating a proper wedding gown, with fabric ordered specially from San Francisco. Mrs. Hodson enlisted the help of several women from town, and soon the ranch house rang with feminine chatter and laughter as they worked on the dress and other wedding preparations. Jackson, for his part, seemed content to let the women handle the details while he focused on spring calving and preparing for the summer grazing season. But he did insist on one special project, renovating the master bedroom that had once belonged to his parents, which would soon be theirs. "It needs to feel like our room, not a relic of the past," he explained as he and Cal removed the heavy old furniture to sand and refinish it. April appreciated the gesture for what it was: Jackson's way of showing that their marriage represented a new chapter, not just for her but for him as well. He was finally moving forward from the losses that had shaped so much of his recent life. As the wedding day approached, April received an unexpected letter forwarded by Deputy Collins. It was from her father's old lawyer in Carson City, informing her that a small insurance policy her father had taken out years ago had finally been processed. The sum wasn't large, just over $300, but it was hers free and clear. "Your dowry," Jackson joked when she showed him the letter, but April shook her head. "Not a dowry," she corrected. "A gift. I want to use it to buy breeding stock, maybe some of those merino sheep you mentioned wanting to try, something that will grow with the ranch with us." Jackson's expression had softened at her words. "You're going to make a formidable rancher's wife, April Emerson." "I should hope so, Mr. Tanner," she replied with a smile. The wedding day in late April brought perfect weather, warm sunshine, a gentle breeze, and wildflowers blooming across the ranch's meadows. They held the ceremony under the cottonwoods by the creek, with Mrs. Hodson, Cal, and Henry standing up with them, and Deputy Collins officiating in his capacity as local justice of the peace. April wore her wedding dress of cream-colored silk with lace trim, her hair arranged with wildflowers instead of a veil. As she walked toward Jackson, who waited for her looking more handsome than she'd ever seen him in his new black suit, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a desperate young woman with nothing left to lose, to the beloved bride of a man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, with respect, with patience, with understanding, and finally, with a love that had grown steadily stronger with each passing day. When Jackson took her hands in his eyes shining with emotion, April felt the last shadows of her past fade away. This was where she belonged. This was home. "I, Jackson, take you, April, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he vowed, his deep voice carrying clearly to their assembled guests. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." As April repeated her own vows, she infused each word with the depth of feeling that had grown in her heart for this honorable, steadfast man. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Deputy Collins declared with a broad smile. "You may kiss your bride, Jackson." Their kiss was met with cheers and applause from their friends and neighbors. As they turned to face their well-wishers, April caught sight of Mrs. Hodson wiping away tears with her apron, while Henry whooped enthusiastically, and Cal offered a rare, full smile. The celebration continued into the evening, with tables set up under the trees, lanterns hanging from branches, and a feast that showcased Mrs. Hodson's finest cooking. There was dancing to music provided by one of the neighboring ranchers and his sons on fiddle and guitar, and plenty of laughter as Jackson, not known for his dancing skills, nevertheless took his bride for several turns around the makeshift dance floor. As twilight deepened into night, the guests began to depart, offering final congratulations and well wishes. Mrs. Hodson, who had arranged to stay with her sister in town for a few days to give the newlyweds privacy, embraced April warmly before leaving. "I always knew Jackson would find happiness again someday," she whispered. "I just never imagined it would come from such unexpected beginnings." Finally, April and Jackson were alone, standing on the porch of what was now truly their home. "Mrs. Tanner," Jackson said softly, testing the sound of her new name. "Welcome home." April looked up at him, this man who had changed everything, with his simple declaration that she deserved better than the fate that had nearly claimed her. "I've been home since the day you brought me here," she told him, "but now it's complete." Jackson swept her into his arms then, carrying her over the threshold and into their new life together, a life built on respect, courage, and a love that had begun in the most unlikely of places, but would endure through all the seasons to come. In the years that followed, the Tanner Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. The merino sheep April had wanted to add proved a wise investment, their wool bringing good prices at market. The cattle herd expanded, and so did their family, first with the arrival of their son James in the spring following their wedding, then daughter Elizabeth 2 years later, and finally twins Michael and Sarah 3 years after that. Mrs. Hodson remained with them until age finally forced her to retire to live with her sister in town, though she visited often to spoil the children and offer April the occasional respite from the busy household. Cal eventually took a wife of his own, a quiet, practical woman from a neighboring ranch who seemed perfectly matched to his reserved nature. Henry, always the more restless of the brothers, eventually moved on to try his luck in the silver mines, though he returned for visits full of wild tales and presents for the children. As for Wilkins, his influence in Lovelock gradually waned as the town grew more civilized. The arrival of the railroad brought new businesses and families, diluting the power once held by men of his ilk. When he finally died of liver disease some 10 years after April and Jackson's wedding, few mourned his passing. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Jackson surprised April with a trip to San Francisco, the city his sister had once disappeared into, now transformed in his mind from a place of loss to one he could share with the woman he loved. As they stood on the deck of the ferry crossing the bay, April leaned against her husband, still strong and handsome despite the silver now threading his dark hair. "You ever think about that day in Lovelock?" she asked. "The auction." Jackson's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes. Mostly I think about how close I came to not being there at all." "But you were," April said simply. "You were there when I needed you most. And found everything I never knew I was looking for," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. As they watched the sun setting over the Pacific, April reflected on the journey of their lives together. From her silent tears on that auction platform, to this moment of quiet joy beside the man who had declared she deserved better, and then had spent every day since proving just how much better life could be when built on a foundation of true partnership and abiding love. What had begun as an act of decency from a stranger had blossomed into the kind of love stories were written about enduring, steadfast, and stronger with each passing year. And in the end, they had both found what everyone deserves but too few find. Not just a love that rescued them from darkness, but one that continued to light their way forward, day after day, through all of life's changing seasons.